So this is the first reaction video I've ever attempted, and it's reacting to a YouTuber I really like, John Nathan Cordy. He's a guitar YouTuber, as usual, he has these great clickbait titles that just kind of suck you in because you think he's going to make a controversial statement, and then he actually reverses it within the video. And this one was called, "What's the point of playing jazz?" Or "I feel stupid. What's the point of playing jazz? I forgot and got lost." And I'm not going to play his video on this video. I don't know the rules about that. And it just a lot of times feels like a crummy thing to do to someone who's put time into making a video. But I'll probably put the thumbnail on screen and link to the video. Can you see it? It's a really good video, and he makes really great points. But he's touching on a subject I've been thinking a lot about and that I've experienced a lot of frustration about. But his video was talking about, he kind of expressed how, he's put a lot of time into studying jazz, and he feels like he kind of has it, and that's where I'm at. I started trying to play jazz probably in 1994. So what is that? 31 years. And I can kind of play it, but as far as like the exact language, like exact bebop lines or the exact right way to navigate rhythm changes or complex chord progressions, I don't quite have it. If I was on a jazz jam and trying to play a standard and I had to solo over it, and this is on bass typically, I'd probably get some side eyes for kind of playing stuff that's not idiomatic or, period accuracy. And he also expressed, the kind of how it's a turn off, the competitive nature of it, the cutting session. And keep in mind, that would be people competing to see how accurately they could reproduce idiomatic musical techniques or vocabulary. And anyway, so the rest of his video, he talked about how he kind of rediscovered that it's just productive from an educational standpoint, or like stretching your brain, increasing your vocabulary, keeping your chops to like learn a tune a week from like the standard jazz repertoire. And that's an excellent idea, and that's something I've tried to do in different periods. And he's starting a jazz school, or kind of like a collective where everyone can kind of go through these tunes every week and stuff. And that's a really good idea, and you should go to his channel and check that out. But he also expressed other things like, and this is a common complaint with jazz, it's like jazz is a very loaded word at this point because the problem is semantics. But before I get to that, a common complaint is like he was talking about Coltrane and giant steps, and how he doesn't prefer to really, he doesn't enjoy the sound, or maybe, the amount of notes Coltrane is playing and all that kind of stuff. And that's a common complaint, that jazz is very cerebral, kind of goes above your head. It's hard to listen to. And that's a separate video I've been wanting to make about how to listen to jazz, because it's definitely an acquired skill, and there's specific domains within jazz that you can listen to. And once you know what you're listening for, it can become really, really enjoyable. There's maybe like 4 or 5 different things you can focus on within the music. And I'll just talk about one of those, like with Coltrane specifically. A lot of what jazz is about is people's individual voices and personalities, and how that would manifest through sound, through an instrument. And I think Wynton Marsalis pointed out how like every jazz player has their own voice, and in some people you can even hear like neuroses, like a neurotic element or obsessive element. And Coltrane's, I think that's where he was coming from, is that he wanted to hear the flurry of notes. He wanted to hear the wash of chords. He wanted to hear chords superimposed on top of other chords. But he played a melodic instrument, so that's why a lot of why he was playing fast, it was to imply harmony. He wanted to hear that harmony. But every player is going to have a different voice, and so it's not so much about seeing it as this is canon vocabulary that I'm required to learn, but instead seeing it as this was one guy's voice. And I can appreciate that, even though it's not the voice I would choose, I can appreciate that that's their voice. Just like in verbal language, everyone has their own voice. It's not, you know, it's very uncommon to say, man, I hate the sound of their voice. You kind of allow them to be themselves, and that's what jazz is. But his video really stimulated. I've been wanting to make this video for a long time, but my response focuses on semantics. It's like, what is jazz in the first place? How are we defining jazz? Because that's a big problem. And in my mind, you can put jazz, the word jazz functions in two separate ways: as a style, but also as a musical approach or a method that you apply to music. And as a style, the word jazz is not really functioning well at this point, because if I say the word jazz to two different people, they're going to have two completely different concepts or sounds pop up in their mind. One guy might think of Wes Montgomery or like a bebop style, but another guy might think of John McLaughlin or John Scofield. Very different musical styles, but both falling under jazz. So it's not a good functional descriptor of a musical style anymore. And you can see that functionally because people have to put a qualifier in front of it. They have to say smooth jazz or cool jazz or West Coast jazz or modal jazz or swing jazz or bebop or Dixieland jazz or New Orleans jazz, second line, you know, hard bop, post bop, fusion, jazz rock, you know. Those are styles of music that have a certain sound to them. There's a certain beat, there's a certain thing the bass does, there's a certain harmony, there's a certain vocabulary that goes along with that. In my mind, jazz is more of a musical method or philosophy even. It's an approach to music. And the way I like to think about it is, here's the best way I can explain it. Imagine going back to the advent of jazz, where it started. So you're in America, and it's this cultural melting pot. People coming from all over the world, all these cultural influences. You know, it's predominantly African American, so you have the rhythms and the language, the gospel music, and these influence from there. But there was also like a Jewish influence to jazz. There's Scots-Irish. There's German. There's, you know, Louis Armstrong got his start playing in the school band. They were probably playing Sousa marches, you know, and that's influenced by Strauss. Or like Ellington, you can clearly hear Debussy in his chord voicings and stuff. So there's really a melting pot of influences from all over the world. And imagine you're hanging out with your bros and you all have these instruments. One guy has a clarinet, one guy has a banjo, there's a piano player, there's a trumpet player. And it's like, man, we got these instruments, we're from all over. What should we play? Let's play together. But what should we play? Because prior to that, if you wanted to play as an ensemble, you had to have a composer or a arranger decide what everyone was going to play, and then you run it down and it all fits together. But if you're just hanging out and you want to have a jam session and you have these instruments, because jazz is primarily an instrumental music, we have these instruments we want to play. What should we play? Well, maybe the banjo player says, have you ever heard Somewhere Over the Rainbow? And that's kind of a bad example because that wasn't around at the advent of jazz, but that's a melody that pretty much everyone can immediately hear in their head. The clarinet player may go, oh, yeah, I know that one. I think I got that one. And then maybe the piano player goes, I kind of know the chords to that, but I'm not sure about some of these chords. But the banjo player goes, whatever, let's just hash it out. And so they just kind of hash it out in the moment from memory based on each of their personal identities and personalities and influences and where they're coming from. They kind of hash it out in the moment. The nerdy term for that would be they extemporaneously interpret a shared repertoire. So, and within that, in that moment, maybe the piano player plays the wrong chord in bar 3, wrong, that it isn't the chord that was played on the recording. It's a different substitute chord that still works with the melody. So he reharmonizes the chord progression, and that's part of jazz. But during the advent of jazz, they were using a shared repertoire that came from the radio, from sheet music was the primary way to distribute music. You had sheet music and people would play it on piano for entertainment because there was no TV or anything. And then they had like Broadway tunes, show tunes, which would have been more popular and with a lot of people knowing them. And so they used these songs, shared collective repertoire, as vehicles to extemporaneously interpret in the moment via improvisation based on their individual influences and experiences, and personalities and voices. And so to me, that's what jazz is, and that's a beautiful thing. And it's closely tied to something called postmodernism. And I know I'm getting deep here, but I just find this interesting that postmodernism is a word that, I don't know about you, but it's like I heard that word a lot and I would always go, okay, yeah, but I didn't know what it really meant until recently. And I kind of watched a YouTube video about it or something. And it seems to be, these French philosophers came up with these different tracks of ideas, and then it all kind of got lumped in together as postmodernism. And some of it, I don't really identify with it, but there was one particular concept, and I think the guy's name is Jean Baudrillard. He observed like the continuity of human culture and kind of extrapolated and projected where it was going to go, and theorized that what happens is that at the beginning, with human culture, they produce these art objects and these artifacts of human, language and concepts and theologies and art. And at first, it reflects reality. It's an attempt to kind of reflect reality or make meaning of reality. So they're trying to make paintings of the real world, and to express an idea, but it's connected to reality. And as time goes on, especially in the modern period, the 20th century, where we had machines and mass production, Baudrillard theorized that media, art objects, and language and whatever would start to become so mass produced that it would start to saturate culture, and it would start to blur the line between what is actual reality and then what is just kind of a artifact, cultural artifact that's been created. It would become so saturated in our field that the art objects, the media, would start to become real and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Or like how photography came out and all of a sudden it wasn't a painting that's trying to represent, it was a photorealistic image. He called that simulacra, that it's a simulation of reality, but he theorized that the simulation would start to be mistaken for real, and that we would be so bombarded that, what's the word? Pervasive, that media would become so pervasive that it would become real. He called that hyper reality. And we're living in that right now. That's why this sounds super nerdy, but I find it interesting that if you look at what Jean Baudrillard talked about, we're in that state now with the internet, that information internationally distributed in real time. We're exposed to all culture humans have ever created, all at the same time. It's like a big soup of chaos where it's almost like, well, Baudrillard framed this state in a negative way because he said it led to cultural collapse, the collapse of culture, that we would be so saturated that it's almost like, what is culture anymore? It's like there's no the lines are completely blurred between that type of culture and this type of culture. It's kind of all mixed together and referring to itself. It's recursive. It's, instead of being influenced by reality to create a media object, which is like a straight line, the media objects influence the creation of media objects, which influence the creation of media objects. It becomes recursive. The output feeds the input, and it's self-referential. It's a feedback loop on itself. So I think this is called media theory or media ecology, and it's framed in a negative way because it results in entropy, chaos, cultural collapse, and you can see that it seems like even in the 90s you would have emergent cultural movements like grunge, which occurred because of geographical isolation in the Pacific Northwest. You had a style, a scene kind of emerge because of the isolation. So you would have cultural movements popping up, but notice that's not really happening anymore. I'm sure it happens on a small scale, but it's not going to be one that changes culture or like takes over, because you don't have that isolation. Everything is now influenced by everything else. There's many examples of how I could point this out. Like one example is like, I've been watching a lot of guitar YouTube, and on an aside, that's why I like John Nathan Cordy, because of his jazz sensibilities. I like watching his solos because he has a little bit of jazz vocabulary, but it's almost even smooth jazz in a way, but in a cool way. So it's interesting that he doesn't have confidence in his jazz playing, but I know exactly what he's talking about. He's being able to play idiomatically. On another aside, this brings up something about that's really useful as a player, to be able to identify if you're thinking in these terms. And I think another music YouTuber, I'm pretty sure it was Andy Edwards, which is another music YouTuber in the UK. And I think this was early on, before his channel kind of blew up. But he was talking about musical competency in relation to like the Instagram guitar phenomenon. These guys that post short reels of super crazy stuff. And that how when people do that, what they're trying to demonstrate is competency. They're trying to show that they can play fast, they can play accurately, they can play idiomatically correct. And if you look, a large part of music has kind of gone in that direction. People are don't seem to be trying to do radical new stuff, or, something out of left field. Excuse me. That it seems to be they're trying to reproduce what has already happened in the most accurate or competent way possible. And the thing is that's not really captivating. I mean, but we all feel that pressure, and, especially as a freelance musician. Like, I'm a freelance bass player. People know me as a bass player. I've really been a multi-instrumentalist the whole time, but as a bass player, or John Nathan Cordy seems to be like a professional guitarist. He's playing freelance. There's a pressure to demonstrate competency. The line of thinking goes, well, what if I get a gig where I have to play rhythm changes? What if I get a gig where I have to play giant steps? I better prepare to be able to show that I have competency to be able to play that in an idiomatically accurate way. But imagine playing a jazz tune where maybe you're not navigating the chord progression in an idiomatically accurate way, and you're also even just making clams, you're just making mistakes. But what if your interpretation of that chord progression, somehow there was an emotion to it, there was a certain vibe that it created? Wouldn't that be preferable to just demonstrating competency? So that's something I've thought about ever since I think it was Andy Edwards that pointed that out. Kind of check yourself at all times and okay, am I focused and worried about achieving competency and demonstrating competency, or am I trying to make an expressive statement? But I'm going to get to the point of this whole video, because let's take what we talked about, the advent of jazz, and how these guys were kind of had these instruments. They wanted to jam. They used a shared repertoire, and they interpreted that on the spot in an improvisational, extemporaneous way. Well, let's fast forward to 2025, because we have more than the radio now. We have more than sheet music. In fact, we have the internet. So really, we're exposed to all audio that humans have ever created. Is up for grabs. All the, sheet music, that's ever been created. Like, I actually think I have a book, because one thing about jazz is it's predominantly an orally learned art form. You learn it by ear. It's like a language, but not exclusively, because books like this, Coltrane went through this book, and this book was for 20th century modern classical music to make atonal 12-tone music. But Coltrane took this and synthesized it. He adopted it and put it as part of his vocabulary. And that's what I want to talk about next, because jazz essentially is a method, a musical approach. And it's not a musical technique. It's kind of a set or an umbrella of techniques that you can apply to sonic information. So it's about assimilating. It's about hearing sounds in your environment, and then you assimilate those. You absorb them like a sponge, and then you kind of reconfigure them according to your own taste and your own personality, and then synthesize them. You may take something from Slavinsky, something from Debussy, but then Coltrane took something from Indian classical music, and then he kind of all synthesizes it into one thing. To me, that's what jazz is. It's not, oh, you can only play with flat wound strings and there's no bending. That infuriates me. Like, oh, you want to play jazz guitar? You got to get a hollow body, or a semi-hollow body. You have to get big flat wound strings, and there's no bending of strings. And it's like, what? It's like, listen to Sidney Bechet on clarinet at the start of jazz, or the trumpet players or saxophone players. There's bending in jazz for sure. But see, that's someone who wants to demonstrate competency. They want to sound like Wes Montgomery did in the 50s. But that's, to me, is not what jazz is. That's an ossified substyle of jazz that happened in the past. So it's about semantics. We need to agree on the correct terminology for things. But what if we modernize jazz to 2025? Now we can assimilate musical vocabulary and techniques and songs and styles from all over the world, from all over time, all over history. And so that was really exciting to me. It's almost like post-style. Like, we're in that postmodern situation where we're so saturated with media and styles that it's almost like there is no style anymore. It's after the period where style was a thing. And to me, the jazz musician now it's about being kind of a vehicle or a vessel to kind of assimilate musical information according to your taste. Like, oh, I like this Indian classical drone, but I like these, hip hop beats or jungle and drum and bass beats, but let's combine that with Debussy type impressionistic harmony put together and apply that to a Taylor Swift song, that the song is less important. It's less important that this meaning that we've ascribed, like a song, a Taylor Swift song, that evokes, okay, well, that's a certain kind of style. It's a country adjacent style in a major key. And so therefore it means these type of cultural things. It's like, no, let's remove the metadata from that song and say this song is a vehicle to apply extemporaneous interpretation on according to taste or influences. Let's bring that Debussy harmony in there and just see what happens and do it over a hip hop beat. That's interesting. And it kind of embraces that postmodern saturation where everything's become recursive, and it's like, okay, well, let's embrace that and see what we can do with that, where everything's up for grabs. All styles in whatever song you hear, oh, that has an interesting melody. It could be a song that came out this year. Oh, that has an interesting melody, an interesting chord progression. I'm going to take that, but I'm also going to combine it with this and this, and I'm going to interpret it on the spot. I'm not going to try to reproduce it. If you look at most music, most musicians, they're trying to reproduce things. They're trying to demonstrate competency by getting the exact guitar tone and playing the exact notes in the correct way and the exact chord progression. They're trying to reproduce things that already happened. Instead, that idea of I'm going to interpret this according to my own voice and vocabulary on the spot, and maybe I reharmonize the chord progression. It doesn't matter. Maybe, I change the beat or whatever. Maybe I'm not remembering the melody exactly how I heard it. Maybe I'm switching a couple notes. That's all part of jazz. John Nathan Cordy talked about the real book and how it's not the best way to learn jazz because some of the chords may be off. But to me, that's part of jazz. It's that it kind of morphs as it goes through time. It's not about reproduction. So there's the jazz, which is this ossified idea where you need to learn the Great American Songbook. And the reason why I know exactly what he's talking about, because it's like, this reluctance of, I feel I need to know these 150 songs, but I'm not super into it. The reason, because you don't connect to that repertoire. It's not relevant to the time period you're living in. That was their time period. Jazz musicians up until the 80s were not looking backwards and trying to reproduce exactly. They weren't trying to make reproductions of things that have already happened. They were trying to do something new. That was the whole point. They were using existing material, but they were assimilating it and resynthesizing it and recombining it and trying to make something new out of it as a way of dealing with the environment. It's tough to live in 2025 where you're bombarded by all these concepts and culture. It's almost, Baudrillard talked about it, that it's hard to know what truth is when there's so many competing narratives. It's almost like truth disappears. And how do you deal with that? Well, this concept that I'm pointing toward, I was calling cyberjazz. It's like a modernized or postmodern form of jazz that deals with the internet age and the fact that the shared musical vocabulary is now the internet. It's not just the radio or the Great American Songbook. It's like all recorded music is up for grabs to learn from and assimilate and add to your vocabulary and to use as vehicles for more kind of invention. I was calling it cyberjazz, but then I saw someone else is using that for a style, even though it looked like the preemptive cyberjazz artist. She's like a French. I didn't listen to much of her music, but it described it as she was using jazz like Billie Holiday type vocals, like a nostalgic, smoky jazz club vibe with saxophone solos combined with like futuristic electronic beats and like lo-fi hip hop stuff. According to my definition of cyberjazz, that still would qualify because she's synthesizing disparate elements and recombining them. But I came up with a different term that I'm going to start using. It's called improsophy. It's kind of like a philosophy. It's a musical method it's a process you apply. The improsophy practitioner is like a function where there's an input and then something happens and it outputs a different thing. You're assimilating your environment. So that's kind of an idea of where to take it. Like I would say in relation to the video, examine any musician that feels pressure to kind of demonstrate competency or, I got to learn the Great American Songbook, 150 songs, even though I don't really know what most of these songs are or the cultural relevance they had anymore. That's postmodern condition. I think that Baudrillard guy talked about how things become a copy of a copy of a copy. You're no longer referring to the original source. Like the original jazz musicians saw those shows. They heard the songs on the radio. Everyone around them were. That it was a shared cultural experience. Now that's ossified. It's crystallized. It's petrified like a fossil. And the reason there's so much inertia to like having to learn those tunes and then keep them up, because man, I've learned hundreds of jazz tunes, but then if I don't stay up on them every day, you forget them and then you got to learn them again. It's because it's not culturally relevant to this time period. So cyberjazz or improsophy, it's like a modern approach to music where there is no style. The style isn't important. The song isn't important. It's like if I had the entrainment machine, we play improsophy type music, and let's say we choose some kind of country song, whereas there's like these cultural connotations, like it's not just like a G, C, and D song with a melody and whatever. It represents Chevy pickup trucks and Ford, all these cultural meanings that are artificially ascribed to that style of music. But if you look at the environment we're living in, that's a complete fabrication. Here's a good way to illustrate it about this copy of a copy of a copy kind of thing. It's no longer the original source. Let's take like blues music and like Jimi Hendrix and stuff. Like, so you had blue music, which it was an emergent phenomenon in the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s. And that came organically out of a certain geographic location, a shared cultural experience, shared cultural influence. But then you had the British guys in the 60s were influenced heavily by this music, and they started kind of, if not reproducing it, kind of doing that thing where they were assimilating it and kind of doing it in their own way. But right at that moment, there's a separation, there's a detachment. It's no longer this organic cultural phenomenon that emerged organically from a certain geographic location and shared cultural lineage. You have these white British guys, which, their cultural lineage is like green sleeves and stuff like that, but they're playing blues. So there's a disconnect there. It's a copy of the original. And then you have back on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, you have American dudes like John Mayer that hear Clapton and hear Peter Green and all these guys. And now he's taking his reference from the copy of the copy. Okay. And then you have John Mayer, and then now you have all of guitar YouTube seems to love John Mayer, which I'm from Atlanta. So I have a lot of shared connections with him. But now they're trying to cop his tone and all his licks and stuff. And you see how it becomes this recursive kind of, they're referring to the art object, not the original emergent phenomenon, but it's recursive. The input's influenced by the output's going back into the input. So, it's kind of, I say embrace that state that we're in, the recursive state. It's like a smorgasbord of musical information, and you can take whatever you want. And I think it's a mistake to prioritize demonstrating competency. Like, I need to learn exactly how they played in the 1940s and reproduce it. Why? To demonstrate competency, so someone might go, oh, cool. It would be better to kind of take the spirit of what they were doing. Those guys weren't trying to reproduce stuff. They were trying to do something new. So do something new. You can take some of the language, take the parts you like, and then combine it with, music from China or wherever. And so that's just an interesting idea. I'm going to talk about it more. I really suggest you check out John Nathan Cordy's video. It was really enjoyable. It was really inspiring, and he brings up really good points. And and the idea to like learn a jazz tune a week is a really good idea. And for the reasons he talks about, to expand your vocabulary, to keep your chops up, to not get in a rut of kind of like the main median type of music we are exposed to or have to play a lot. But I would say whatever tunes you choose, make sure it's tunes that you're into, tunes that inspire you, that have cool melodies that you'd like to learn, cool chord progressions, or even a cool beat, a cool meter, something interesting about it. Not just learning it because you think you have to because you're not competent if you don't. I think trying to become competent, like if you look at guitar YouTube, it's all kind of funneled into this thing where it's like blues licks and this blues tone where and everyone's kind of has this wide vibrato where they're bending sharp and everyone sounds sharp to me. And it's like, see that, yes, if you're demonstrating competency, that you can play idiomatic guitar in a very period accurate way, that's great, but you're going to get lost among the millions of other people that can do that too. So why not be more eclectic? Take some of the blues, take the parts you like, whether it's the tone, whether it's the phrasing, whether it's the vibrato or whatever, but eclectically combine it with your other interests. Don't feel pressure to reproduce period accurate whatever to demonstrate competency, because you're just going to get lost in the noise if you do that. Anyway, improsophy, that's what I'm calling it. I was calling it cyberjazz, but jazz is too much of a loaded term right now. A large subset of people are going to turn off as soon as they see the word jazz, because it brings up so many preconceptions for people. And to me, jazz is not a style. It's a musical device or method or philosophy or approach. It's a way to process musical information. And it contains a certain umbrella of techniques that you can use, improvisation, reharmonization. It's mostly oral based. There's lots of techniques within it, but it's a musical philosophy, and it's very inspiring to me in this world. It feels like a way to kind of transmute the chaos if you kind of embrace it and say, "Oh yes, I'm a sponge. I'm going to assimilate that. I'm going to assimilate that." Even media that you don't like, or you find irritating, you can take it, assimilate it, transmute it, change it to where you do like it. It's kind of a rebellious statement. Anyway, I'm going to talk more about this, but I really enjoyed that video and it inspired me to make this video. You should go check out the video and hope to make more like these and talk about this stuff some more. All right, thanks.